Ja, takole kot obljubljeno sta z nami tudi gosta, ki bosta spregovorila na temo spominov v razdeljenih mestih. Najprej se mi bo pridružil Fearghal McGarry, profesor moderne irske zgodovine na Queen's University v Belfastu. As promised, we continue with our program and first we will hear the speech from Fearghal McGarry, professor of modern Irish history at Queen's University in Belfast. Please give him a round of applause. Lepo prosim za aplauz.
Thanks very much. Great to be here. Thanks to the ambassador for having me and Kinodvor for organising this evening. So I want to just discuss the film for about 10 minutes or so from my perspective as a historian of Ireland, but also as someone who lives in Belfast, although I'm originally from the Irish Republic. And Belfast is a fantastic city, so I encourage you to come, even though the scenes there of the heavy rain are unfortunately a little bit accurate. So this film depicts Belfast at the very beginning of the Troubles in the late 1960s, but it's useful to go further back to understand the roots of the conflict. And the War of Independence between Irish Republicans, the IRA, and British forces that led to an independent Irish state actually ended 100 years ago this year. But Irish Republicans were only partly successful in their struggle for independence. The conflict was brought to an end by an Anglo-Irish treaty that created a new state in the south of Ireland, but partitioned the north of Ireland, which remained within the United Kingdom, but importantly under the political control of a Protestant unionist government. And the Catholic nationalist minority in Northern Ireland were discriminated against and essentially excluded from power for the next 50 years. So Belfast is set in 1969 when finally, after almost half a century, things are beginning to change. And as is occurring in other parts of the world at this time, a civil rights movement has emerged to demand equal rights for the Catholic minority. And tragically, the unionist and loyalist backlash that movement for civil rights triggered would plunge Northern Ireland into 30 years of sectarian conflict. And Belfast shows how these events played out on the ground as minorities who found themselves in the wrong neighbourhoods were burned out of their homes and jobs. And Catholics endured the worst of this violence by virtue of being the minority in Belfast. Thousands fled their homes, some of which were firebombed by Protestant or loyalist paramilitaries, while the unionist-controlled security forces largely stood by and watched. And once it became clear that the unionist government and its security forces had essentially lost control of events, British soldiers, as we see in the film, were brought in to restore order. And although these soldiers were initially welcomed by many Catholics, loyalist violence and the very fact of the return of British troops to Irish streets led to the revival of the nationalist or Republican IRA and 30 years of conflict. Now that conflict came to an end with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, essentially a power-sharing deal, which has been really successful, I think, in ending violence, but can't really be said to have brought peace. And right now, at the moment, the government isn't functioning. So how well does the film depict these events? And I thought it might be interesting to tell you a little about how it's been received in Belfast. So I think Belfast has been really popular. There's been a huge attendance at it in Belfast cinemas. So it's pulled off the difficult trick of combining kind of international success and awards with local credibility and interest. But it's also prompted some criticisms. And I think I'll mention them first because I want to kind of focus on the positive because I think it is a really interesting and good film. So one criticism is that it doesn't sufficiently engage with the politics of the Troubles. And obviously it's a child's eye view of events, so on some levels that's understandable. But some people feel that there's something a little bit unsettling about a very sentimental, warm, even feel-good movie that's set at the beginning of a 30-year sectarian conflict. And I think if you compare Belfast to other films such as Victor Erice's Spirit of the Beehive, the story of another film-obsessed child, but this time growing up in Franco's Spain. That film doesn't flinch from showing some of the darkness of the political atmosphere of the times. So I think one issue with Belfast is that maybe shies a little bit away from exploration of the sectarian nature of deeply divided societies. You know, Buddy's family are anti-sectarian. The film depicts children from different religions attending the same school, which largely didn't happen. And the causes of the conflict are not really made explicit, which is perhaps understood and understandable, but we get the conflict attributed vaguely to bloody religion and to paramilitary bullies. So I think that's in some ways a kind of an issue, because there's obviously a more deep-seated political degree, and the conflict that it's showing stems from much deeper communal vein. The opening of the film, which is shot in colour, features scenes that could appear in any tourist board ad, and Queen's, my university, appears in it. But to me, that kind of signals that the Troubles, which are shot in black and white, belong to the past. They're sort of safely consigned to history. And in reality, the North Belfast neighbourhood, which is depicted in the film Tigers Bay, and where the filmmaker Kenneth Branagh grew up, that experienced some of the conflict's worst violence, and that neighbourhood is yet to recover. It remains economically depressed. The peace walls separating Catholic from Protestant areas remain. In fact, in some places they've increased in number. And paramilitaries still exert a lot of power in those neighbourhoods. So that's maybe some of the criticisms. The case for the defence, which I personally share, I think it's a great film in a lot of ways, is that the film is perhaps not really about the Troubles. It's certainly not about the political dimension of the Troubles. It's a film about childhood. It's a film about community, and I think it's really beautifully evoked. It's a film about family. It's a film about emigration, which is a very important story in the history of Ireland, and it's a film really about memory. It's a nostalgic film about film, and I think the other scenes where the film jumps into colour are the films when cinema takes Buddy and his family out of the world they're in. And perhaps above all, it's a film about the trauma experienced by children when they realise that there's nothing necessarily permanent about the world which they grow up around them. And I think the film is quite successful because of these universal elements, particularly its beautiful depiction of childhood and family. Another strength of the film is that it tells a story which hasn't really been told very often. Most films set in the Troubles focus on politics and conflict, and in particular on Republican experiences. So we've lots of films about the 1981 hunger strikes when IRA prisoners starved themselves to death. We've got films about the British Army's massacre of innocent Catholics in Derry in Bloody Sunday. We have films about miscarriages of justice experienced by Catholics. And we have a lot of films about the IRA, most of them awful, Hollywood kind of films. Sometimes the IRA are presented heroically, sometimes less so. But they're politically, problematic. But in contrast, we have very few films which depict the experiences of Unionists and the Loyalist majority community in Belfast and Northern Ireland. So Belfast is really unusual because it tells the story of a Protestant community, and it tells that story in a very sympathetic way. And I think it's a film that might not have been made before the end of the Troubles, because the politics of a sympathetic depiction of a Loyalist community would have proven perhaps too complicated, and sort of the funding for most films about Northern Ireland and the Troubles comes from America, so it's geared towards a specific reading of the Troubles. So I think Belfast is really interesting because it's part of a wave of post-conflict films that depict a much wider range of lived experiences and look from more unusual political angles at the Troubles. And two other examples which spring to mind are 71, which presents a sympathetic portrayal of a British soldier landed in the middle of West Belfast, not having a clue what's happening, and Good Vibrations, which tells the story of the punk scene in Belfast. And I think what these films have in common is that they're telling less obviously politicized stories. They're films about life in the Troubles rather than films about the Troubles. And I think one reason for Belfast's popularity is its focus on the everyday experience of working class people. You know, its detailed depiction of that community provides a kind of social history of the Troubles. And many people have responded warmly to what they see as a depiction of the childhood that they remember from growing up in Belfast. So I suppose the point is Belfast may be sentimental and it may be nostalgic, but the emotions are rooted in the filmmaker Kenneth Branagh's own childhood in that community. And in fact, many of the scenes in this film are detailed in his memoir, Beginning, which he wrote in 1989, long before this screenplay. So there is an authenticity to some of these stories. And on one level, it might seem strange that people are nostalgic about a film that depicts Belfast at the moment of its descent into communal violence. But it's a nostalgia for a Belfast before peace walls, paramilitary murals, soldiers, checkpoints, and daily reports of murders. You know, all that is about to come down the line. And I think a final reason for the popularity of the film that I want to mention is that even now, 25 years after it has ended, the Troubles is still not widely discussed in Northern Irish society. Few schools teach the history of the Troubles in any detail. We still have no museum that tells the story of the Troubles, and indeed one effort to create a museum of the Troubles almost brought the power-sharing government down a few years ago. And when I came to live in Belfast, being from a very different part of Ireland, I quickly realised that even though the political parties and the media endlessly discussed the Troubles in very polarised ways, it was understood that the Troubles shouldn't actually be discussed in everyday life with people you work with or with your neighbours. For example, and certainly within mixed company. So you don't talk about the Troubles unless you know who the other people are, what their religion is, where they're coming from. So it's a topic that's discussed a lot in public, but not discussed in civic spaces. And for example, I lived in a mixed area of Belfast, and I had close neighbours who I was quite friendly with for many years, and it was only after they died and I went to their funerals that I realised that they had actually been involved in the Troubles on a number of different sides as it happened, but there was an agreement in the neighbourhood that none of this should be discussed or acknowledged. So one of the experiences I've had in recent months I've been struck by is how in discussing the film Belfast, many people start discussing their own recollections of growing up in Belfast during the Troubles, and that's not normally a conversation that you hear very frequently. So returning to the title of this evening's event, and just to sort of make a conclusion, I think that this is the role of art in a divided society, whether it's film, theatre or other forms of culture. They have a really powerful role in enabling conversations about difficult histories, difficult pasts, and conversations that move beyond politics and ideology to consider the human experiences and costs of conflict. So I think that might be a good point to hand over to my colleague on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fearghal McGarry, for your really detailed analysis of the movie, and it was really great to hear all this evaluation in the context of Irish history. Thank you. Lepo prosim še za en velik aplauz profesorju McGarryju. In kot smo slišali, se selimo še v nekoliko bolj bližnje kraje, ki pa so bili prav tako razdeljeni, in sicer nekaj več o tem nam bo zaupala dr. Kaja Širok, direktorica Go Borderless 2025, Evropska prestolnica kulture Nova Gorica, Goricija. Lepo prosim za aplauz.
Hvala. Gremo v angleščini, ne? Ja. So, you finished very well with culture, so I will take from culture and go back into the past. Go Borderless 2025 It's the capital of culture of Nova Gorica, and actually in its candidacy, Nova Gorica decided to ask the city of Gorizia, so the city on the other side of the border, to do it together. It's quite a pilot project at the European capitals of culture, because till today there is no capital of culture done by two border cities together. Of course, there are border cities, not just around us, they're all in all Europe and not just in Europe, and you can just start counting them, they're everywhere. For me, growing up in the border city, so Nova Gorica, I cannot say that it was different, because actually it's a part of your identity, and you really don't realize it, that you are different because you live near the border. But basically years later, I just realized that we had a plus. And that plus was not just the learning of the language, it was a plus of understanding other cities or other societies or other cultures in a completely different way. The capital of culture, Nova Gorica, Gorizia, will have one very interesting project within the whole perspective of what we are going to do. And this is a project called EPIC. EPIC wants to be a museum on the border. The idea came out after years of working with oral history in the border areas and connecting and discussing with people from the border, from the Italian, Slovene minority in Italy, Friulan minority, or people who were able to speak the Friulan language, and so on, also with the newcomers who also live in the territory, the very multi-layered understanding of the past and the identity of the territory. And what we really want to achieve is to do a museum on the border or near the border, which will be able to talk about the past, not from the dominant or historical perspective, but to be able to understand from the individual stories what the identity of the region is. I'm a historian, and for the last 20 years I was also researching the territory from the perspective of the oral history. And what I can say, and what I'm always also saying to the youngers, which are coming, let's say, to the Europe Square, which is the main square divided in two between Nova Gorica and Gorizia, is that 100 years ago, the identity of the territory was completely multicultural. But the best part of this multiculturalism is that our ancestors were able to speak and to understand in between them in several languages. In that period, they called them dialects. But they said that, it was before the First World War, of course. At school, we were learning German. But at home, we were speaking our own language. It could be Italian, it could be Friulan or Slovene. But then, of course, you were able to understand also your neighbor. And sometimes some of them also said that they were able to understand also Hungarian, because there were many people coming from Hungary within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And 100 years later, the youngers are speaking in between them only in English. So this is what happened in the last century in a very multicultural territory. My own story, just for the 5 minutes. I have half of the family on the Italian side, and my family is living on the Slovene side. The Italian part is from the first marriage of my grandfather, who actually, when he returned back after the end of the Second World War, in 1946, he was for 9 years on the African front as an Italian soldier, because we were the citizens of Italy. When he returned back, his wife was already for 4 years married to another man. And actually he decided to stay later on the Slovene side when the new border was made. So there are so many layers, and there are so many identities of the territory, and at the same time, there are so many individual stories, which all together, like a beehive, are really completing the identity of the territory. And just to stay with the story and to finish, one of the most important interviews that I did was with Silvino Poletto. He was a journalist, a partisan, Italian, who told me, when we were young in the Second World War, we were fighting for a good cause, and the cause was to fight Nazism, to fight fascism, and we were really with the heart and our soul into that. And when the war was over, when we returned back home, we find the war in our own families. And that was what was happening in the territory, because from 45 to 47, the Goriška, so this territory was divided within the Allied military government, and the Vuja, which is the Vojaška uprava Jugoslovanske armade, and basically only in 47, the new border, which was an artificial border, was made in between the region, and some families, most of the families in the territory living in the city of Gorizia were cut off. And a lot of them were multicultural or mixed families. So very shortly, this is a very short story, and you are welcome in 2025 to visit us.
Hvala dr. Kaji Širok, direktorici Go Borderless 2025, Evropska prestolnica kulture Nova Gorica, Goricija. I would like to invite you both to come, please join me again. Torej, znova ju vabim v mojo družbo in vas prosim, če imate kakršnokoli vprašanje oziroma mnenje, so if you have any questions or thoughts that you would like to share with us, please, now it's the perfect moment to do that. Če ima kdo kakšno vprašanje z dvigom roke, naj seveda to naznani, torej, raise your hand. Don't be shy. Ok, bomo še mečkano počakali. Aha, tamle imamo. Bravo za pogum. Lepo prosim za mikrofon. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here, to both of you. My question goes to you, because you said that the way the Belfast audience is kind of experiencing the movie is that it kind of opens up this gateway into talking about this topic, privately. But at the same time, when I was in Belfast, we also realized that, on the one hand, there was, the Good Friday Agreement, but then, you also had the killing of Lyra McKee. So there is things, happening again. So maybe you want to comment on that, and if that has also kind of been brought up when they were discussing the, let's say, criticism of the film.
Yeah, so you're kind of asking me, I suppose one issue that maybe sometimes local people have of the Good Friday Agreement is how it's presented internationally is as a terrific success story, and it's in the interests of whether it's the British government or the Irish government. There's a lot of vested interest, the Americans, to present that as a successful narrative, and sometimes you'll see that depiction if you go into museum exhibitions or whatever. You'll get a history of the Troubles, and in 1998 it's over. And I suppose the reality is that conflict in many ways has entrenched a lot of the issues that led to the violence breaking out in the first place. So, for example, Kaja was talking about identity, and one of the big outcomes of 30 years of conflict is to make identities much more polarized. So that film shows Protestants describing themselves as Irish. That tends not to happen now, whereas 30 years ago, and certainly 100 years ago, people were much more flexible about their identities. The violence that you see in that film, going back to borders, we had a border which created a lot of problems with border communities north and south of Ireland, but it also created internal borders in the neighbourhoods of Belfast, and that still exists to this day. And then I think the other thing which happened as a result of the Good Friday Agreement is that a conflict which was, ethno-nationalist and sectarian, a complicated conflict which was fought out militarily and politically, has become much more of a cultural conflict now. And so in many ways, the discourse, the political discourse and so on is quite kind of toxic. And yet, at the same time, something is happening on a more organic level, which is that in the absence of violence, you are getting a lot of different forms of reconciliation, not being led by politicians by and large. In fact, politicians, I think, are often pretty unhelpful in terms of Northern Ireland and entrenching kind of sectarianism, but being led by community initiatives, and which brings us back to culture and museums and so on. I think that's been a much more successful. But you mentioned the killing of Lyra McKee, and obviously there is that question mark as to whether things could ever go backwards, and there's always that potential, I think, where you have, very entrenched conflicts over identity.
Thank you for the question. Še kakšno vprašanje? Any other questions? Please.
Hello, for the man on the left. Are there any good examples of, reaching over these divides between the nations, like in the last time, maybe, I don't know, on other different levels, like maybe food or music or something like that, that kind of try to patch these differences?
I think there's a lot of different forms of reconciliation happening. I mean, one of the forms of reconciliation I'm quite keen on is maybe some of the students that I teach not defining themselves as nationalists or unionists or Republicans. So I think like one healthy response is people being a bit kind of apathetic and defining themselves more by whatever they watch on YouTube or TikTok or whatever. I think that's personally a healthy development. Not everyone is wedded into these historical narratives, and I think some of the worst offenders are older people, who have lived through it. In terms of reconciliation, I mean, there was a huge improvement in relations between the Irish Republic and Britain, and between the two communities in the north and south in many respects. That has met very challenging times of late because of the impact of Brexit. That has put back into play issues around borders. At the same time, though, there's a lot of initiatives, and some of them also coming from the government. Perhaps the best example I can think of is, at the moment, we have a running series of centenaries of the Irish Rising, which began the sort of War of Independence and the various kind of conflicts of that decade. And those centenaries have been remembering history, going back to your point about from multiple perspectives. So the Irish state no longer has a sort of a nationalist memory of history. It's actually doing a memory of history which is nationalist and unionist, and also actually in many ways looking at the experiences of women and so on. And that's been very successful and quite popular in terms of, I don't think history causes conflict, but I think history is an excuse which can be used by people in the present to cause conflict. And I think that's been quite healthy in terms of, redefining and reevaluating very fixed narratives and getting across a more complex sense of the past.
Thank you, Professor McGarry. Any other questions? Še kakšno vprašanje? Izvolite.
I have a question for you, Dr. Širok. I come from the same region as you do, and I wanted to ask you, so you talked about this change of how you understand different cultures, how our ancestors knew 5 languages by not even learning them, and how we, for example, lived the border region as like an advantage that we didn't even know of until we left it. How do you think this region is perceived nowadays when the border is not there anymore, when we are global, when we have access to everything? How do people perceive it nowadays?
A year ago, the border was up again because of COVID. It was, nothing for Ljubljana or for the other cities all around Slovenia, but for us living directly there, the new fence, because in a week the fence was everywhere and it was impossible to go to the other side of the border, only for the one who were living on the other side, but that's another story, and the one who were working there. And for my generation, this was a very catastrophic event. First, because the fence was there again. Secondly, because holidays were coming, it was Easter, and we were used to have some products always from Italy. So it was a complex situation because actually you were not able to get certain products from certain shops from the other side of the border that actually even when we were really very young you were always able to, because our indeed was one of the most open borders in Europe. For the younger generation, so for, let's say, for our teenagers, that was not a problem. That problem never existed for them. It was like, okay, so what's the deal? What's the problem? They don't perceive the border as we did, because after 2004 and even after 2006, when Schengen went out in the territory, the new reality was completely different. And they never really experienced what we experienced when we were teenagers. Let's say for me, the most important thing in my teenage years was to be 12 and to get my own propustnica, which was like a local passport. So that was the most important thing that could happen in your life. You know, the first day you just went there with your own passport and you were an adult, because actually you were able to go on the other side of the border. They never experienced things like that. So for them, everything was open, everything was free. And at the same time, they are not learning Italian. They don't need it. They all speak English. So for us, it was an urge because actually everything was happening on the other side of the border. I still remember, I perceived that actually Yugoslavia invented some products, and this is why you can find them in our shops. But Italians, they invented other stuff better, and this is why you were able to find them in the Italian shops. So globalization was not a part of my mindset. That came later. But yeah, to finish, the new generation has a completely different understanding of the territory. And yeah, they have, I think that right now they have much more friends on the other side of the border than we did. And this is good.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, those were really the strange days. I remember that picture when people were playing badminton and volleyball across the fence, like pretending this is not a fence, this is only a net. Še kakšno vprašanje? Any other questions? Please.
This might be a question for the both of you, so whoever decides to answer it, but how do you think that the values change when people live in such cities that are a mixture or are even on the border? So what values actually come up in those situations, especially with the troubles and a war basically? So is there a difference from the cities that don't get through this in such an obvious way?
I will say it shortly. First, you are much more tolerant. And secondly, you, from your very first small age, start to understand different, I might say, invisible ways of behavior, because you need to behave differently. And it comes completely natural.
Yeah, I would make the same point, actually, that if you're in a divided city, space becomes really kind of important. I used to live in North Belfast, and where a lot of the neighbourhoods are either Catholic or Protestant, and even relatively recently, I mean, 20 years after the Troubles had ended, people would ask me, "Is it safe to walk down this road?" And there's a sort of, in some ways, an invisible geography in which all the areas carved out as Protestant or Catholic, and people understand it and they behave accordingly, not using roads or not using them at certain times of day. And then at other points, and this is, I think, still a big problem in Belfast, there's also then a visible marking of space, so with flags and murals and so on. And I think that creates a sort of an oppressiveness, which is hard to maybe explain with the language of history, but if you read some of the really recent novels about Northern Ireland, such as a really great one I can recommend called Milkman, you get the sense of how that creates not just conflict between two communities, but creates a sort of a closing down of spaces within those communities also. Everybody is being watched and having to say the right thing, and I think that's a really unhealthy kind of dynamic to grow up in. What
about the humor? I had this feeling that there is one thing that is always necessary in the divided cities, and that's the humor, because you have to live through painful times, and it's better to laugh at them. Is that also one of the virtues that is present in Belfast?
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, the novel I just mentioned, Milkman, is actually really funny, but it's also really disturbing. So I think with appalling, unpredictable, chaotic events, that also creates a sort of an atmosphere of license and lawlessness and carnival. So all these things can happen together. But I mean, I living in Belfast and not being from there, I think people have a lot more in common than they have apart. And one of those is just a kind of there's a really working class sense of humour in which people will be cut down if they have any kind of sense of pretentiousness or airs and graces. And I think that the film is actually really good in conveying that sense of Belfast humour, which is a bit like Glaswegian, Glasgow humour for that matter. It's very distinctive of a kind of urban industrial kind of culture.
Thank you. Še kakšno vprašanje? Any other questions? Okay, I hope I didn't skip any of the hands. Dobro, jaz mislim, da se lahko v tej priložnosti še enkrat zahvalimo našima gostama in pa seveda priložnosti, da smo lahko uživali takole ob slovenski premieri filma Belfast. Once again, thank you for your questions, for your answers, for your opinions, and of course, thank you audience. I hope you enjoyed and of course enjoy the rest of the evening. Hvala in prijeten večer.